I'd like to now turn it over to Janet Woodcock and Andy Plump for the final panel, The Pandemic and Beyond, the Future of the FDA.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you very much to the audience for bearing with us for the whole day. It's been an incredible day, and we step now into what I think is our highlight event and our last panel. This panel is called Pandemic and Beyond, the Future of the FDA, and we have a rare, if not unique, gathering. I mean, how often in five people do you have four former FDA commissioners, the acting commissioner, and the nominated future commissioner? I would say that this is truly a unique opportunity. Janet and I are going to be co-moderating. Janet will also be at times a panelist, apropos, of course, to her role. We'll be taking on three topics and then a lightning round. The topics will be preparing for the next pandemic, which I think we have to also think about preparing to manage the current pandemic still, streamlining interactions with FDA, and then perhaps most importantly is the role of the patient in drug development, the role of the FDA there. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Janet, and she's of course someone who needs no introduction, and in fact, more than that, she's already been introduced because she had a chance to give a plenary session earlier in the day, and then Janet will introduce to the remainder of the panel. Janet.
Thank you, Andy, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our four prior commissioners. It is a unique opportunity, and if I went through their CVs, I would take up the entire hour. So, and their accomplishments. So what I'm going to do is just introduce them in order of, when they served. That first would be Mark McClellan, who is now at Duke Margolis. Hi, Mark. And he was commissioner for quite some time. I served under Mark in different roles. Then Margaret Peggy Hamburg next. Peggy also served during the Obama administration, and I also served under Peggy. Then Rob Califf, who is also the current nominee for commissioner. Hi, Rob. And he also served in the Obama administration, of course. And then Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who I worked for most recently, who served during the Trump administration. So we are not going to, as I said, go through all of your accomplishments in great detail, or we would be spending a great deal of time on that. So what Andy and I would like to do is really more have a conversation on these matters, and people should feel free to jump in. So I'll hand it back to Andy for the first question.
Scott, I'm going to give you a heads up. I'll say a few words, but then I'm going to hand the topic over for you to hear your thoughts. And this topic will be about preparing for the next pandemic. But of course, I sit here having been diagnosed yesterday with COVID, feeling kind of meh. So maybe the topic is extended, and it's actually thinking about how we manage the current pandemic. It's, of course, I'd say a topic you could write a book on, but you already have. So with that, Scott, I'll hand it to you, and then we'll open up to the committee for additional comments.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I hope you're doing well there. Sorry to hear that. I thought I would just take about 5 minutes to share some thoughts. I know there's going to be some discussion on thinking about the next pandemic. Hopefully we're seeing the peak of some of the current spread of infection, at least on the East Coast. Looks like New York City and Washington, D.C., Mid-Atlantic, Florida probably have already peaked. The epidemic curves are starting to tip down. That doesn't mean things are going to improve very quickly. The hospital systems there are still going to be pressed, but cases are going to start to come down. I'm worried about the Midwest, where they went into this Omicron wave with a lot of Delta infections, so hospital capacity is limited, and they have yet to really feel the full brunt of the Omicron wave. And so you have to worry about states in the Great Lakes region, the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, others where hospital capacity isn't as good, similar to what New York was facing, where they went into this with a big Delta surge. But in terms of thinking about planning for the next pandemic. I think one of the challenges we had with this pandemic was that a lot of our historical planning was very pathogen specific. We always anticipated that the next pandemic would be caused by a flu, and a lot of the planning was based on flu, on a model for influenza. And COVID showed that when you prepare for one pathogen, you may not have the infrastructure to deal with something else. And, you know, with respect to the diagnostic testing, which really became one of our key blind spots early on, we always anticipated that if we were struck with a pandemic flu, the installed base of testing equipment would be adequate, because you'd basically be differentiating between flu A and flu B. If you knew a pandemic strain was prevalent, all you needed to do is diagnose someone with flu and you could surmise that they had the pandemic strain. But all of a sudden, that installed base of flu diagnostics wasn't really relevant here, wasn't useful. We suddenly needed to create new collection sites for respiratory samples as well. We couldn't use the installed base of, for example, blood collection sites that we have in this country. So you had to create de novo mass testing sites to collect respiratory samples, something we had never planned for. And we literally ran out of, cotton swabs and things like that, and had to rely on PCR testing and laboratory developed tests, which was very inefficient in the outset of the pandemic. And we didn't have a diagnostic test to know not only where the virus was, but where it wasn't. And a lot of our early challenges stemmed from that, because we had to reach for population-wide mitigation, largely because we couldn't tell where the virus hadn't yet arrived. We had to assume it had infiltrated every city, when in fact, in retrospect, it hadn't, and only certain cities were at significant risk and really had to rely on mitigation at the outset of the pandemic. And a lot of our political challenges, as you know, stemmed from the initial national shutdown that we implemented, when in fact, many parts of the country probably could have waited a couple of months, and we could have implemented that on a more rolling basis as the virus moved across the country. So I think the bottom line is we have to go into planning for the future with a mindset that we can't predict what the pathogen is going to be. Even if we get it right and the next pandemic is caused by a flu, and it probably will be, the virus could present with very novel features. It could present with neurological symptoms or GI symptoms. So the influenza-like illness surveillance system may not be sensitive at detecting it. It could evade our existing antigen or molecular tests for influenza, could evade the antivirals that we stockpile. It may not be amenable to egg-based manufacturing, which is the installed base of flu manufacturing. So we can't assume that even if we get the pathogen right, that it's going to have features that allow it to be reached by what we would plan in advance. And so what that means, and where I'm getting, is that we need to focus on developing core capabilities, both infrastructure and policy capabilities that could be amenable against a range of different potential threats, and try to identify what the universal needs are and focus on those universal needs in our pandemic planning. We're still probably going to take a pathogen specific approach. There still probably will be certain things we want to stockpile that may be pathogen specific, but I think trying to focus on where there's core capacities that we could develop that could be deployed against a range of different threats is where we're going to get the most security. And so I break it into sort of 5 buckets, and I'll just go through them really quickly, Andy, because I don't want to take too much time. One is organizational. I think that, we need going forward an agency with the capacity to quarterback the response, deploy the kinds of tools that we need, gather information and speak to the public, to synthesize it and speak to the public. I think there was a perception that CDC would be able to play that role. I think those of us who know the agency well probably understood that they were going to be limited in terms of their capacity to play that kind of role. They're not an operational agency. They're retrospective. They have a retrospective mindset. They're not an agency accustomed to talking directly to the public. They typically filter their information through other public health agencies and providers. And here they were thrust in a very different position of being sort of a consumer-facing organization that was prospective, that had more of a national security mindset, rather than the sort of high science retrospective agency that they're accustomed to being outside of certain narrow, sort of things that they do on a routine basis, like, investigate outbreaks of foodborne illness, which I would argue they're still very retrospective on, probably too retrospective, given the fast-moving nature of some of those outbreaks. So we need a different capacity, and it probably is going to reside with CDC. I'm not saying we need a new agency, but we need to change the sort of some core function within that organization that has more of that forward-leaning national security, consumer-facing capacity to deal with a public health crisis of a national scope. The second is the capacity to scale production. I mean, we always knew that antibodies-based drugs would probably be the first line of defense against a novel pathogen. We always knew that we lacked excess biological manufacturing capacity in the US, as well as vaccine manufacturing capacity. And the question is, how do we build in more resiliency into the system? How do we create the capacity to scale production and not just do what we've done in the past, which is build facilities and mothball them. That doesn't work. We need to keep a hot base, not a warm base. We need to overinvest in facilities that are operating, that have the capacity to then create some kind of surge production in the event of a crisis. Third is the capacity to design novel therapeutics and vaccines. I think we need to look at the technology platforms that can be quickly adapted to a range of potential threats. We need to look at pan-class drugs, trying to get pan-class drugs approved. Here, the mRNA platform, obviously I'm on the board of Pfizer, the mRNA platform proved to be a nimble platform, and it has the potential to be a nimble platform that could be deployed quickly, even as viruses mutate and even as new viruses emerge. But there may be other technologies like that, and particularly small molecule technologies, where you could have a platform technology. You can sort of perfect that technology, validate it, and then have it available to be to engineer drugs against very specific pathogens going forward. And I can think of a number of small molecule technologies that would have those characteristics as well as other vaccine platforms beyond just mRNA that would also be potentially nimble and be able to be deployed quickly against a range of novel pathogens. Fourth is the ability to detect new variants of coronavirus and new viruses as they emerge. We've built up an infrastructure to be able to do sequencing at scale. I think we need to continue to invest in how we have a global system for collecting samples, sequencing them to detect not just new variants, but also novel pathogens. We have much more of an ability to do that quickly. And we have much more of an ability to use sequencing information alone to try to deduce characteristics of viruses in ways we never were able to before, in advance of having all the epidemiological data to actually inform how viruses are going to behave. I mean, that science isn't that advanced right now, but it's getting more advanced very quickly, what we can deduce from sequence information alone. So continuing to invest in that. And I would put an exclamation point on that and just say that the policy measures that we've done at a global scale, when I'm talking particularly about the trade and travel restrictions that we've implemented when new pathogens have emerged, new variants have emerged, most recently in South Africa, have, I think, caused serious harm to the global order of cooperation and trust when it comes to surfacing information about new pathogens. I think we could still rely on friendly nations to do the right thing, even though they know that there's going to be punitive measures taken against them. So we've conditioned all the wrong behaviors. But, other nations that aren't as friendly are going to be more reluctant to surface this information in the future, knowing that the first thing that's going to happen to them is they're going to be subject to global travel restrictions. They're going to be punitive and economically harmful. So if anything, we've conditioned the wrong behaviors at a global scale. So we're going to have to really invest in how we collect this information. And I've long argued that we're going to need more of a national security mindset around how we do this and try to get other capacities, other capabilities involved in this mission. We can't just rely on global cooperation and the good graces of other nations entirely. And the final thing is we need to think about what the nexus for global decision-making is going to be. I think the WHO demonstrated in this crisis it was not the right convening body for shared global decision-making. It wasn't able to be a forum for global joint decision-making, for global joint operations. It largely saw its role in as a sort of political advocate for certain constituencies, certain nations, certain blocks of the world, not as a convener. And we need to think about what that convening entity is going to be. We need sort of a NATO for public health. And the WHO, I think, has just shown it's not capable of playing that role because it has too many divided constituencies to be able to bring together the nations that have the capacity to respond at a global scale to a crisis like this. So those would be the 5 things, the buckets that I would point to, Andy. And I'll pause there and appreciate the time.
So before we open it up to the other commissioners for comments on this, I'm curious, how are we doing in working towards that 5-point plan? I mean, you could argue either that we're stuck in the middle of this horrible crisis, so we can't think about the future, or you could argue that this is the only time that we're going to be able to think about the future vis-a-vis pandemics, is if we wait 6, 12, 24 months after COVID has passed or become endemic, we'll forget about it.
Yeah, I've been really surprised that there hasn't been any effort on Capitol Hill to try to legislate on this. I mean, there are some senators and House members who've worked on these issues in the past and been serious about pandemic preparedness. You just haven't seen a really serious bipartisan effort undertaken where you have sort of a special commission and a joint effort among Democrats and Republicans on the Hill to lead the creation of legislation and a framework for how we would respond to future pandemics. I don't know why that is. I think that part of it is just the political environment we're in. Part of it is the fact that we're still in the current pandemic and it's hard to look forward to the next one. But I also think part of it is that it's going to be hard to get the political alignment that we need going forward around these issues. Particularly, there's a lot of skepticism that's been sown around public health authorities generally, and this is clearly more on the political right, but I think it's a little bit more bipartisan than we appreciate. It's not just the political right that are deeply skeptical of CDC, that felt that public health agencies were overwrought, that the recommendations they made were poorly informed, and intrusive into people's lives, and that they shouldn't be further empowered in a setting of a public health crisis. They should actually be regulated and restrained. And I think any kind of vision for how we create better capacities going forward have to be predicated on strengthening public health authorities, strengthening the role of public health agencies in a setting of a crisis. That's going to be hard to achieve when you have sort of probably a pretty large swath of the public deeply skeptical, for example, of CDC and further empowering them. How do you get a political consensus around how to empower public health agencies for the next crisis? So I think that's part of the impediment here, is that when we open up this can, I don't think we're gonna see what we get as extremely constructive. The debate that we end up having is going to be difficult. And that may be part of the impediment here, that serious people know that they can't have a serious conversation about this right now.
Well, I'm certainly skeptical, given that we're still in crisis management mode and we're not thinking about establishing standing structures for the future. But
if I may add, Andy, though, the regulatory agencies worldwide, and Peggy, this is a lot through ICMRA that Peggy founded, have really started working together very closely. And, I have been pushing this a long time for manufacturing so that we could get things moving and we can allow innovation in manufacturing without having 500 different applications and so forth. We've made a lot of progress. First of all, our inspectors and everything can't go out. We have to rely on each other. And, we're through vaccines, through other things, we've really made a lot of progress in that area. So I think in some areas, Scott, we're making progress, like on platform technologies. Progress is being made and so forth. I think in some of these larger public health issues are going to be much more difficult. I agree.
Do you think if the next pandemic happened tomorrow, Janet, that we'd be better prepared?
Well, I have, of course, I have some additions to Scott's list. He's not surprised. Yes, I think we would be somewhat better prepared. But as Scott said, we don't know what it'll be. We need to do scenario planning rather than just plan everything around influenza. And what if it were this? And so we have different scenarios and we understand how we might act under different agents were starting a pandemic and how they were spread and so forth. So I think the planning has to be, as Scott said, much broader than it has been.
I want to keep us moving, but I want to open up, Peggy, maybe one comment from you.
Well, I'd like to make a few observations, and maybe we really want to talk about the role of the FDA and all of this, but I do think we have to recognize that these issues have actually been part of ongoing planning, discussion, deliberation, and even efforts to create new programs and policies. The problem is that we are driven by this sort of crisis and complacency perspective, where we identify a set of critical issues to work on, some of which were just discussed by Scott. And of course, we've learned a lot during COVID. And science and technology and the world has changed. So, I think that we are in a different place than we were 20 years ago. But sadly, there were reports and studies and plans put together decades ago that identified many of the same issues that we're talking about today. And if this isn't and we kept saying this is the wake-up call, and now we'll finally, put in place the capabilities that we need, and then competing priorities flows out those really I think genuine concerns and commitments. So, if this isn't the wake-up call that prevents us from hitting the snooze button, I don't know what will be. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep the pressure on and to really identify the things that are necessary to do to better prepare for the next pandemic, but make sure that those things also link to ongoing, sort of routine, so-called peacetime needs, because that's going to make for real success and ongoing commitment, both the political will and the resources to achieve our goals. Scott mentioned we need, hot manufacturing bases, for example. That's crucial. That's an example of what will benefit us when the next big one comes, but benefit us day to day. And I think, one difference with this global pandemic is that people have come to appreciate the role of the regulators in a new way and really understood, not fully, but much better than before, that you have to engage the regulator as a true partner in response, and that, in fact, smart, thoughtful regulatory strategies can actually speed progress towards the medical products that we need, speed progress towards getting accurate information to consumers and policymakers. And as Janet mentioned, the regulatory community working together around the world is crucially important.
Yeah.
As well.
All right. So wake-up calls, and I'm going to go back threading a theme from the meeting. Dr. Drake invoked Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was a 1970s movie. Maybe that should have been our wake-up call. We missed it. All right, Janet, I'll hand it to you to take on the next topic.
Okay, well, the next topic, and I don't know how much Rob's willing to say about this, but I'm sure all of our panelists have a lot to say, is about streamlining interactions with the regulators and how has that been perceived as going? What have we learned from this? What can we do better in the future? I'll turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, since I am in the witness protection program, I'm going to be brief and relatively muted. It's not a great time for me to make definitive statements.
Yeah.
But I think we all know, I think what Peggy said at the end is really important. And I know everybody in the panel agrees with it, that smart interactions between regulators and the outside world, including the medical products folks, but also the patient, those who are affected, can have an enormous impact on producing better and more timely products. And so, I'd like to hope that because of the renewed appreciation and the advances in technology, so that interactions can occur like the one we're having today. Remember what a production it used to be to go to the FDA? You'd assemble a team and have to find a hotel and spend 2 days. And, just getting through security at FDA can be a major event for many people on the other side of the wall. But now there could be more frequent communication. And I'll just add one other compliment to that, though, because, I'm obviously not involved in the user fee negotiations this year, but I remember last time, Janet, one of the biggest issues was industry wanted more meeting time with FDA. Mm-hmm. And there aren't even enough offices at FDA to have the meetings that industry wants to have. And so all of these things that look really good have to have people and technology and space allocated to them if they're going to work.
Others' thoughts on streamlining interactions or where we should go with interaction?
Well, maybe Mark hasn't spoken yet, so I was going to let him go first, but since he's not speaking up, not always like him, I just would like to, underscore the fact that, in recent years, real progress has been made, and it's been striking. And I think, Janet, you have led through many administrations and many commissioners an effort to really help to advance the application of the best possible science to the regulatory process, to streamline and modernize, and to not look at it exclusively as a science issue, although that's important, but also administrative systems as well. But the CERSI program, I think, is an example the kinds of strategies that can make a difference. Because if we really want to streamline medical product development and innovation, we have to make sure that the research is first and foremost done in the most meaningful way to ask and answer the critical questions. And the partnership that CERSI embodies, I think, enables that to better happen. And that we're really thinking about how do you work in an environment where you can know where the advances in science and technology are occurring, and also anticipate them so that the regulatory authorities aren't, as an afterthought, trying to figure out how to regulate new areas. And again, I think that's something that is relatively new in terms of how FDA is oriented, but has made a difference. And again, Janet, was a leader on that, and it's an area where the CERSIs, I think, can make important contributions. And then, really looking at how we can eliminate steps that don't really matter or aren't essential. And certainly the COVID experience has shown us that we can kind of telescope some aspects of the development process and the regulatory review process. We can do things in a more collaborative way. We can have more information sharing as we go along. It involves at points taking more risk, but it also has clear advantages. So I think, both trying to put it in the context of what CERSIs can accomplish and also our COVID experience, I think we are continuing to gain insights and new ways of doing things that are of value.
Yeah, Peggy, I'd like to pick up on that because I think a great example is a very recent one. It doesn't involve the CERSIs, but involves NIH. And, they have their RADx program that is kind of like a Shark Tank approach to getting new technologies for diagnostics. But recently they started a program where they will do the testing for the antigen tests. They'll do the laboratory and clinical tests against standard battery. And of course, the companies have more trouble getting a hold of the relevant clinical samples and doing this. So now we're getting standardized testing of the samples. It's being done by this ITAP program at RADx. And we've already approved two products based on that, two antigen diagnostics. And the program's only been up a couple months. So, people say we take a lot of time to look at these diagnostics, but a lot of time is spent in trying to figure out what the company did, what kind of laboratory and clinical testing they actually did, what were their samples. And this shows a tremendous power of just centralizing this and getting it done. It can go really fast.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the same theme. There's certainly a need for, and I think FDA has made a tremendous amount of progress over the last couple of decades in terms of interaction with industry and clarity about what's expected in the regulatory process. And that makes it work more efficiently, and certainly can keep building on that. But one of the key themes that's come up in this session about the pandemic, and I think in the previous sessions too, is the need to move from one-off approaches to system or platform approaches. And we've seen a lot of that happen already in the regulatory process around guidance, around mechanisms for validating biomarkers, but still really a long way to go in terms of moving from one-off to systematic approaches. Janet, you, Indy Abernethy, Scott, others have put a tremendous amount of effort in over the last few years around improving data science, not just for trials, but hopefully for real-world evidence as well. And that includes further steps that could help as well, like building out trial platforms. We had some discussion about that. I'm sure Rob brought it up earlier around the recovery trial network in the pandemic in England. We could use that kind of platform in a lot of disease areas to bring down costs and time of development. And we're really just in the early stages of incorporating real-world data into real-world evidence systems, given how much heterogeneity there is in the data, and bring it together effectively across different systems, something that would have been really helpful, would be really helpful now as we try to understand the effectiveness of treatments, vaccines against emerging variants. And so that fits with your theme too, around making a more standard process or platform for validating COVID tests, but it could also apply to post-market systems for accelerated approval products and many other areas. So more around getting to platform seems important. And I would just highlight that that's not something that FDA can do by itself. If we're talking about real world data, that means much more interactions with health systems, not just the ones that usually participate in academic research, but the ones that are delivering care to most Americans, pharmacies, community doctors, et cetera, and also more interactions with the people who are purchasing healthcare and can have some impact over, developing cheaper manufacturing and more reliable manufacturing methods, or developing better evidence if it's on questions that they think are important, in addition to the issues that matter the most to the FDA.
Janet, I wonder if you want to make a comment about computing. So there's data that we've talked about, but I have the advantage of living in probably the most elaborate computing system infrastructure in the world right now. And the difference in getting simple things done inside the FDA versus what I see now is profound. And I know you're working hard to modernize it, but one quick story that you may remember. As a cardiologist, it seemed obvious to me that if you put a hip or a stent in somebody, it ought to have an identifier. So if something goes wrong, everybody could be called and said, that thing inside of you need to see your doctor. But it turned out, as we were trying to implement that, CMS was opposed to it. And I called Andy Slavin and said, why are you opposed to this? He said, we're not. An hour later, he called back and said, oh, yes, we are, because most of our computing architecture is in COBOL, and it would take us 13 years to implement one change in the billing system. Right. So unless we fix this fundamental computing infrastructure, it's people will wonder why some things take a long time. It's because it's not being done in the most modern way.
You're singing my song. I'll tell you, I'm working on it. At least the little piece that FDA owns, which is just as bad. It's really very, very bad. But I hope we can get that modernized.
And I want to emphasize, this is not the people at FDA. It's when you have computing architecture, which is 30 years old and has a legacy, it costs money to replace it. You have to fix it.
Yeah. Scott, you have any thoughts?
I would just pick up, thanks, Jen, I appreciate that. I would just pick up on something Rob said about at the beginning about the interactions. I think that just in terms of the sort of nuts and bolts of interacting with the agency, I think that the pivot that the agency had to make in the setting of the pandemic towards more virtual interactions opened up a lot of new opportunities. I think it's the in-person interactions, in my experience, having been now on the inside and the outside, I think are very important. You lose something when you have a virtual interaction. You lose a level of engagement and an understanding that you can derive from people when you're in the room with them. So I think it's important that the agency, and I know they will, look to get back to that when it's safe to do that. But what the shift towards virtual interactions, I think, has sort of enabled, if we think about it more strategically and more systematically, is looking at new points in the review process where you may be able to, potentially supplant some of the in-person interactions, but probably even better augment them and create new opportunities for interactions, some virtual, and in getting back to the ones that were always in person. So I think that to the extent that we've always talked about trying to facilitate more interactions with sponsors, now that we've kind of created these platforms, they've been, vetted by national security agencies. We know they're safe to do, and people have gotten socialized on them. Now, using them to create more touch points and interactions in a review process, I think could be a real big opportunity.
Well, again, as the previous panelists were talking about the narratives that need to get out there, though, there's a whole narrative outside of this conversation about how FDA should not engage in interactions with drug developers and device developers and so forth, because that causes regulatory capture and this and that and the other thing. So I really think people don't understand the scientific dialogue that goes on and the need for that. And those folks who are not in the FDA really probably, in my mind, need to add their voices to that, because we can't talk. I mean, on one hand, we're talking about streamlining, and many of these things will be very, very helpful. On the other hand, if we are supposed to sit apart in the ivory tower and be judges, then, I think a lot of the scientific progress will be lost. And
Jen,
that would be
that debate obviously has been going on. That criticism about the agency's contact with sponsors has been going on for a very long time. It's been going on as long as I've been, around the agency. Do you think that it's getting more resonance now?
Yeah.
And could you maybe talk a little bit more about why that would be getting worse? I think part of it may just be, maybe these are just tougher times we're in. Part of it may be, look, FDA is doing more that matters and has really made progress on accelerated approvals, on making for a more efficient development process, which means more products coming to market sooner than they might have otherwise. So it may be that to address these issues, it would help to broaden out the lens. So certainly industry and FDA care deeply about getting the regulatory processes right, but you can understand why there might be some concerns about independence or lack of transparency. If we really are talking about more platform approaches, though, FDA has done a tremendous amount to engage patient groups more actively, patient perspectives in the development process. Same thing might go for practicing providers, for purchasers of healthcare. They're going to have to figure out how to use these treatments in actual practice and use them effectively. Sort of the difference between safe and effective for FDA and reasonable and necessary, which includes safe and effective, but other considerations too for purchasers like CMS. So maybe some efforts around at least big areas where a lot of innovation is possible: cell and gene therapies, cardiovascular drugs, neurodegenerative treatments, where we just haven't done a great job even necessarily of using the treatments we have to improve outcomes equitably across the population. It's broadening the lens, but I think we need to try something different here to bring more of the public along, and also hopefully to make more of an actual difference in population health. Working with all of these stakeholders certainly helped in some of the areas where we made the most progress in the pandemic.
I agree with you.
Right. Oh, I was going to say, demonstrating the value that comes through this kind of partnership and collaboration across sectors, I think is crucial. And we certainly saw that with Operation Warp Speed and the vaccine development during COVID. I think some of the problem, though, also comes from another phenomenon that we've seen sadly during COVID, and that is, this sort of lack of trust and confidence in critical institutions, including public health agencies like the FDA, and more broadly, sort of a denigration of the value of science and data. And so I think that, as we move forward, the demonstration of value of these partnerships is actually absolutely crucial. The role that industry science plays, is substantial in advancing our ability to actually harness, discoveries in science into real world products. And we need to communicate that. But we also, I think, FDA has to really demonstrate its trustworthiness. You mentioned transparency, Mark. I mean, I think really talking as much as possible about what FDA does, how it does it, and why is crucial for policymakers and the public to understand.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Jen, I'll take over and transition. It's a great point.
Let me say one thing, though. I do think some other agencies, regulatory agencies around the world, along with their tech assessors, have been trying some of these things. Just to point Peggy and Mark we're making. They've brought together the tech assessors, the patient groups, the payers, and the regulatory agencies in certain topics like cancer drugs. And they have had a broad conversation amongst all these so that they don't simply take their narrow viewpoint, but you kind of broaden the circle and understand from the different points of view. And Andy, that does go right into your next question, but I think that is important.
And I was going to add that, of course, the partnership between industry and FDA is critical. There's also an independence that's obvious that the FDA has to maintain, because there is not just a perceived, but a real conflict of interest on the industry side. And I think that's another piece, Peggy, that creates confusion in the public. So if I may, each of these topics that we're taking on with this particular esteemed group could take hours. So we're going to go fast. And before we get to the lightning round, there's one last topic, and that's one I think that shares themes with the one that we just talked about. And the topic is elevating the role of the patient in drug development. And the shared theme is, as you were mentioning, Rob, we're so antiquated in how we actually manage data in this country. And the way that we stream data to FDA is text. We don't actually stream data; we stream text, which is very early 2000s. We could, if we banded together, if we had the resources and we made it a priority, we could be in a very different place.
We're working on it.
No, I know, and it's not a criticism; it's the reality. And it's the same thing around.
It's terrible.
It's the same thing around the role of patients. I remember when I joined industry. Stepping into industry from academia, as whether you come into industry or FDA, you come from academia. In 2001, we used to debate who is our customer, which was a very foreign concept for me as a physician scientist to have a customer. Is it our commercial group? Is it a regulator? Is it a physician? We never talked about the patient. It's only recent that all of us have realized this epiphany, which is that it really is about the patient and the work that's going on, the role of patient advocacy groups, the role of patients in defining endpoints in clinical trials, and more recently, the role of ensuring that we're representing the diverse patient base in our trials, that when we're making drugs that are applicable and well studied for all patients. It's something that's front and center. So let's take this topic on, and maybe Mark, some comments from you, and then Peggy, some comments from you.
Well, again, I think FDA has made a tremendous amount of progress in engaging patients more. There are a lot of challenges that come up, especially around unmet medical needs, and there's so many, despite all the progress, that we haven't yet addressed. But there's a good foundation to build on there. I think here I'd like to turn the comment about patients into not just the importance of getting safe and effective products to market and having a way for patients to access them affordably, but how they actually get used in practice. And again, lessons from the pandemic, when we knew we had some opportunities for developing vaccines, we had this multi-pronged parallel process to get past the usual obstacles of a long and uncertain vaccine development process that included things where FDA played a central role, like in helping to get regulatory alignment around trial design and enrollment and so forth, and like helping to scale up manufacturing. But to really make this work, it's taken some other steps too, where our systems, frankly, aren't quite as well developed. So with emerging concerns about side effects, and especially concerns the public has about the rapid development of products, whether in a pandemic or otherwise, we need better post-market, stronger post-market systems. And we're making some progress there, but most data, to Rob's point, doesn't talk with each other. CMS, I think FDA, I think FDA needs substantially more support for the enterprise modernization that Janet's been leading. But if you think FDA needs more support, think about the people at CMS who haven't had any of these sorts of infusions of resources for dealing with new kinds of technologies, bringing together data longitudinally around the patient, really learning what works best in actual practice. We need it for quality improvement as well as for better post-market evidence systems. So there too, I think there's some real opportunities for FDA to collaborate more proactively with CMS, with healthcare systems in order to get these better data supports and better evidence systems in place so that we can make more progress. And a lot has been made of the worsening population outcomes that we've seen in the United States, the increase in health disparities in the course of the pandemic. But as Rob knows, those outcome trends at the population level are heading in the wrong direction for the pandemic, despite all the progress we're making on cancer therapies and cardiovascular disease and so forth. And so just getting to a more systematic approach to reaching patients and populations, building on what we've learned in the pandemic, I think would be really helpful. That probably means not only new supports for better post-market evidence systems, but maybe looking at what we've learned about paying for therapies more at the population level in the pandemic, rather than kind of the traditional one-off approach there as well. So I hope we can broaden the lens for patient engagement to get to what is actually in evidence making a difference in patients' lives out there in the world, not just getting to the regulatory approvals.
Do you think, before we turn to you, Peggy, for your comments, do you think, Mark, that FDA has the levers to ensure that sponsors are doing the right things by way of patients?
I think FDA needs help. FDA's done a lot to try to make accelerated approvals work by imposing requirements on post-market studies. And I expect there was some discussion earlier today around things like how having a clearer post-market study framework in place to address important safety issues, side effects, long-term confirmation of biomarkers, et cetera, could happen. It's just that FDA is only one set of the levers to do that, and FDA works through its individual relationships with individual companies. In contrast, healthcare purchasers work with healthcare providers across the country. They can take a more systematic approach potentially to supporting these efforts. There's a lot of activity underway now to try to pay more. Andy, going back to your comments, to pay more when the patients actually get better outcomes in the real world populations. You're not just paying for the services, but tracking what is actually happening in terms of adherence to therapies and how well they're doing with patients in medical practices. It's a key part of quality improvement efforts too. So FDA can't do this alone, but I think there are some opportunities for synergy if we take some of the same approaches that we've taken over the last couple of decades with the regulatory science accelerations, the additional resources to improve and streamline the development process, and apply the same ideas on the post-market side. That's also going to be important for future pandemic preparedness too, where, once again, we saw that some of our biggest challenges were not just developing the therapies, but getting them distributed out to people who could most benefit and tracking how they're actually doing as the pandemic changes, what their effects are in different groups of patients, how well they work against variants that emerge, et cetera.
Great, thanks. Peggy, your thoughts?
Well, I don't know how much time we have left. I guess a few quick thoughts. I mean, Mark, really laid out a very, big, high-level vision. In terms of things that FDA sort of has on its plate to advance, more concretely in terms of the patient-focused patient engagement. I mean, I think one is really thinking about how do you integrate the patient experience and assessment of a disease into the actual evaluation and clinical study of a product. How do you do rigorous, robust scientific studies that integrate in, patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences and experience, the symptoms that are important to them versus what researchers think might be important, et cetera. So, the sort of structuring of clinical trials and the research process to get at the patient perspective in a more concrete way. Then how do you engage patients in those clinical studies? And, we've been talking about how COVID, did provide, sort of new insights into the ability to push clinical trials out closer to where patients are. And I hope we can continue to do that and find ways not just to do our studies in, ivory tower research institutions, but in places where we can reach a broader range of patients. And of course, the importance of educating the public about the importance of research and how it's done and why, so that we can also work harder towards the goal that was talked about earlier in this conference about, greater diversity in clinical trials and really making sure that our clinical trials capture the patients, the individuals most in need of some of the answers and products that will emerge from that work, and then also providing information to patients and caregivers who need it about appropriate use and the whole, notion that Mark was touching on of the lifespan of these products. It's not just getting them to market, but actually getting them to be used and appropriately used and further refine our understandings of that over the course of the lifespan of these products, so to speak. So I think that there's all kinds of ways in which we have to advance this work, but there's some very concrete challenges within FDA for how the FDA work is structured as well.
Great. No, you're bringing up. Sorry, Scott, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just had one quick point, if I can. I think we should appreciate how much of a sort of evolution there's been at the agency in sort of recent decades towards more patient engagement, incorporating the patient into the policymaking and the regulatory processes and structure around that, and also how much of a recognition there is inside FDA that part of its mission is to talk directly to patients. And so you have an ongoing dialogue with patients, both through intermediaries as well as just direct communications. I think FDA, more so than maybe perhaps any public health agency, has really advanced this and seen this as part of its mission. And it's now culturally ingrained in the organization. One of the challenges, though, to sort of advancing this has been that, at least in my view, that you're dependent upon the review staff to do this direct engagement and make this part of the routine work of the division. And they all do. I mean, you have a clinical mindset. This is cultural. It's built in now to the expectations. People want to engage with patients, engage with the public, but it becomes hard when you have to process X number of applications, and that's what you're being judged against. There's PDUFA goals set against that, and then you have sort of this other component of the mission that you want to engage in, and it's almost like becomes an extracurricular activity. So I think we need to think about that in terms of how we resource the agency and how we staff the agency. That this gets built into the expectation of what the review staff should be doing, and there's actually time set aside for it and resources set aside for it as we think about like funding the next round of PDUFA and things like that. And there's been resources enabled for this, but I think we really should think about this as a big goal of how we resource.
Well, we live and die by our metrics and our key performance indicators, but there are always unintended consequences, unfortunately. I'm curious, Rob, Peggy was bringing up both the diversity opportunity and also the opportunity with digital and data, bringing trials to patients. And you've commented, and I've been intrigued by this, about the potential irony that the two may be in conflict with one another, and that actually with the digital and data revolution, we may actually be reducing diversity in what we're trying to do. Maybe you'd like to extrapolate on some of that, if I've gotten it right, actually, if I've heard you correctly.
Yeah, it's hard to totally be data-driven in that assessment, but at least what I've seen so far indicates that as we've expanded digitally in the research world and in many other areas, and it is pretty clear right now, if you look at telehealth as an example, that this already activated, highly educated people gravitate to the use of technology and are really good at using it. And I think the culprit is that we haven't allocated the human capital, the people, for example, in rural neighborhoods, it would be a great source of employment to have community health workers that went to the elderly couple's home and help them figure out how to use the digital technology that they need. And so, unless you have an intentionality to be equitable in access to digital technology, it will work against you, and against that goal, which I think is one of our most important goals, because how else are we going to reach the rural and underserved populations unless we integrate the human and the digital? And I do think this new law, the new funding for making broadband available everywhere in the U.S. is absolutely critical to this.
Great. I want to get to our lightning round, but Janet, I want to give you a chance to make at least a brief comment on this topic, because it's one that you've been very outspoken around.
Well, I believe, as people probably know, I believe that probably for the federal funding of clinical trials and industry funding, there should be a set aside that should be constant for investigators in rural and underserved areas that will sustain them and will allow them to participate in a clinical research enterprise. Because I think we've been going about this the wrong way. I think we have been trying to sort of what the Noah's Ark approach of how many people we're getting into the trials. And actually, I think what we ought to do is support the investigators.
Great. All right. Well, Gottlieb is starting to bear down on us. We still have a few minutes. So you can give us a little bit of light.
Andy, take your time. You got 5 more minutes.
All right. Good. Well, that doesn't sound like take my time. That sounds like we have to rush through 5 minutes. Right? So we're going to do our lightning round. And I'll simplify this a bit, and I'm just going to go clockwise on my screen as I see you. I don't know if that's true of everybody. I'm going to start with you, Scott. So the 2 questions, 1 to 2 bullets each, are first, the biggest challenge facing FDA. And then the second is a prediction for 3 to 5 years from now. What can we expect from FDA?
Look, I think the biggest challenge Janet touched on, I think coming out of the episode that we've been through over the last 3 years, there's eroded public confidence in public health institutions generally, right or wrong. And there's going to be more skepticism of what they're doing and more desire to regulate those activities. And I think this is going to bleed over into the FDA realm, in part around the interactions that the agency has with the constituencies that it needs to engage with to do its work effectively. I mean, we all understand the importance of engagement in the scientific process. I think that's going to be something that is going to be challenged in the broader community, and we're going to need to make the case for that. I think in terms of the opportunity set, I think the opportunity set is going to come from the scientific breakthroughs that we're seeing. And I'm most enthused by what we're seeing. You and I talked about this, Andy, the other day, actually, on cell and gene therapy and regenerative medicine. I think that we're going to enter a point in time in the very near future that we're going to have much more curative potential than we even are seeing today. And our fundamental understanding of the biology of diseases that have been very hard to drug, particularly neurodegenerative diseases, psychiatric diseases is going to get perfected. The brain is sort of the last frontier of biology we don't really understand well. And I think we're right on the cusp of some, major breakthroughs there. We're going to see a tremendous amount of innovation coming through in a very rapid fashion. And there's going to be sort of an inflection point in the near future for that.
Thanks, Scott. Janet, you're next up.
Well, to Scott's point, though, I'll ask what Mark asked me 20 years ago, but will we be able to afford it? I'll never forget you asking me that, Scott, because that sort of started the Critical Path Initiative. Like, how can we afford this? I think there are several, I'll just go with challenges for the agency. One is resources, and I think I've spoken to that at different time in this meeting. Unless the agency is getting so resource constrained, it really, people are just beside themselves. And then number 2, the fractures in our society are becoming greater. And so regulatory is one of the flashpoints, okay? Because if you might say, oh, this should be regulated more, youth smoking, whatever it might be, right? Youth tobacco use, whatever it might be, marijuana, And then they have people on the other side saying, the agency should be abolished because, we should be able to do whatever we want. And these currents in society make it extremely difficult to chart some kind of course that is a reasonable consensus path forward. And in the face of all, as Scott said, all this exploding new technology, I think this is going to become even more difficult.
All right, thank you. Peggy.
Well, try to be quick, and I'll echo some of the themes already out there. I mean, I think in terms of challenges, really addressing, as we come out of COVID, morale and staff burnout is a huge concern. Janet's closer to it, but we need to be able to support a robust FDA employee base. Public confidence and trust, huge, as was just being discussed, and resources. I mean, sadly, for all of our tenures as commissioner, I think advocacy for FDA and the resources it needs has been an important aspect of our job, but now more so than ever. And looking, 3-5 years out, I mean, I hope that FDA, number one, will have successfully addressed those challenges, but that it will be the active leader of a vibrant ecosystem for biomedical product innovation. I mean, I think COVID underscores what, I think many of us were thinking about before, which is that if we operate in stovepipes rather than in partnership, and if we don't sort of recognize the importance of aligning, economic investments and incentives with our scientific agenda, with our regulatory framework, with our reimbursement strategies, and with our, community engagement and public understanding, even, the best discoveries, the most creative innovations won't really make a difference, and that we need to think very carefully about how to align this ecosystem with unmet public health and medical care needs, along with advancing science and technology.
Thank you. Mark.
I think we're down to literally our last minute, but let me just pick up on agreeing with all of those themes. And back to that conversation that Janet and I had, I think it was in 2002 around the critical path initiative, is how do we help the FDA staff and our country do all of this more efficiently? And Janet, a big theme there was manufacturing. I think that's still not solved, or at least now we're dealing with much more advanced and sophisticated manufacturing and some opportunities to bring down costs, improve reliability and ability to reach all populations that way. But we've also seen more of an emphasis, and I think this is another fundamental thing that FDA and other government public health agencies are going to have to wrestle with, of having more of a population health or social focus, not just on individual decisions. So that's come up certainly in food safety considerations, but in opioid regulation, in tobacco and alternative nicotine delivery system regulations, and the pandemic with considerations around contagion and community impact. This is also a huge theme in the healthcare delivery side, where we've seen costs go up, outcomes get worse. And as Rob was saying, some real opportunities to move care more out in the community, rely on digital support. To Scott's point, early diagnosis and access to treatments that may be transformative is really important, but that's going to take a lot of tracking of how these technologies are doing after they get to the market, if we're talking about, 20-year, 30-year lifetime impacts. So we're not really well suited for that. The good news is there's a lot of opportunity here at FDA. The CMS leadership has made their top priority shifting the focus of the work that they're doing into supporting getting all people into longitudinal outcome improving care relationships, which would benefit from the same kinds of data systems that we're talking about here. So I am hopeful for the future, but whoever that next commissioner is, he's going to have some, he or she's going to have some big challenges. Maybe I can say he. I hope Janet Woodcock is going to stick around to help make sure that that all goes as well as possible. Janet, you made a tremendous difference in all of these issues.
Yeah. All right, Rob, just maybe leave us just on a positive note, a prediction for 3 to 5 years from now, positive, and who better to come from than from you?
Amen. 3 to 5 years from now, we will have rebuilt public trust, remembering that that mistrust is a growth factor for misinformation. And I think we got to aggressively attack that, and I think we will. I have no worries about technology moving ahead. It's so synergistic right now. I think that's going to happen. And the one thing we haven't talked about, of course, is agriculture. And if you look at actually what affects this chronic disease problem that we've had of declining survival, a lot of it is driven by what people eat and how they think about what they eat. And we have amazing opportunity there right now to improve food and what people eat, which I know is a focus that Janet has. So 5 years from now, we should have a population which is much more trusting, living in a digital environment that's supported by broadband everywhere and eating better.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to you all. My job as an R&D head is really tough, but it doesn't hold a candle to what each of you do and have done. I can't thank you enough. It's a thankless job. You're very much out in the public, but we all appreciate, myself as a citizen, as a patient, really thank you. And Janet, a huge thanks to you for everything that you've done over the past few years. It's really just been remarkable. And not just over the past few years, over decades. So thank you. Thank you all. And
Take care.
I see that we have Kathy and Koldev bearing down on us. So Koldev, I'll hand it over to you.
It's all good. Hey, Andy, wonderful session. Janet, Andy, thanks for organizing this. Andy, this was your idea. I can't thank you enough, and Janet as well. So much good information. I'm going to watch this video 2 or 3 times, which is going to be available in a few days. I also want to say that we should have a repeat performance at some time in the future, maybe when Rob's no longer in the so-called witness protection program, as you call it, Andy. Also, I think the Oscars are coming up soon, and if there's a category for moderating a session at a biomedical meeting while recovering from COVID, I think you're the front runner. So thank you so much. Be well.
Thanks.